So we've seen the demand side of the economy through the AD curve, the aggregate demand curve, which is derived using that AE and Y, that expenditure, the aggregate expenditure function that we saw. We just discussed the supply side of the economy, or the macro economy, which is the aggregate supply curve. And we can bring them together to get macroeconomic equilibrium. Price level on the y-axis, real GDP or real Y, whatever you want to call it, on the x. We have this downward sloping aggregate demand curve. We have this upward sloping AS curve. Remember, it's relatively flat for low levels of real GDP. Where they meet is our macroeconomic equilibrium. Has a Y0 level of real income, real national income or real GDP, and a price level of P0. So here's our equilibrium, our macroeconomic equilibrium. Now what we need to do is thinking about, well, what if something changes in our model here? What if there's a shift in the AS and the AD curve? What's going to happen? So let's quickly maybe erase this, and let's talk about changes to equilibrium. So let's begin discussing changes in equilibrium and kind of this simple model that we've come up with, this aggregate supply, aggregate demand model that we've come up with. All right, so let's start by kind of categorizing different kinds of shocks to the AD or the AS curve. So, we have this macroeconomic, I'll quickly draw it over here. We have this upward sloping AS as we just saw, and this downward sloping AD, and where they meet we have this equilibrium P0 and Y0. So we can either think of a couple different things happening, although maybe in reality these things are all happening at the same time. The aggregate demand could shift left or to the right, or the AS curve could shift to the left or to the right, and that's going to change equilibrium. Well, we kind of call these shocks, or we categorize them in a certain way based off kind of the direction, and in particular their effect on Y. So what I mean by that is for AD shocks, so shocks would just mean that some kind of shift, because something is changing in the system and kind of moving us around. So that's why I say shocks. They can be expansionary, and by expansionary, this would mean AD shifts right. So if the AD curve shifts right, for instance, we can see the price level is going to go up and this Y is going to go up. And so it's called expansionary because it has this upward pressure on Y, or real Y is going to go up as a result. The other kind of category would be a contractionary. And this is if the AD shifted left, or shifts left, if I wanted to keep the wording a bit more consistent. So if the AD curve shifts to the left, we see that Y is going to go down, right? And so that's why it's called contractionary. And so expansionary and contractionary have to do with kind of the effect on real Y. In the same vein, we have our AS shocks. So it's going to be expansionary if the AS curve shifts to the right. So for instance, if technology improved or factor prices went down, this AS curve would shift to the right. We'd call that an expansionary aggregate supply shift. So notice that when AS shifts right, they have opposite effects. The effect on price is just to have price go down. The effect on Y is for Y to increase. Well, the direction of the price and real Y changes with AD shocks is in the same direction. And sorry, I should write here, we have contractionary obviously as well. And this is when the AS curve will shift left. So if it shifts left, we have kind of upward pressure on prices, or prices, the price level is going to go up, and real Y would go down. So that's why it's contractionary. All right, well so we kind of know how to categorize these now. We're kind of learn some of this language that I might be starting to use. But let's take a closer look at these aggregate demand shocks first and kind of think about the mechanics behind them. And we're going to start to think about, well, we had the simple multiplier before, and that was that, we kind of learned it's the size of this horizontal shift. Well, maybe there's something else that's called the multiplier, which is kind of how actual equilibrium changes. So let's take a closer look at AD shocks.